that the fountainhead of the ancient Christian ethic was here. It was originally the task of each member of the order to be a compendium of all knowledge, all known knowledge. That was the reason for the long term of training. If humanity was totally wiped out, except for one individual, he should be capable of re-establishing everything from his own resources.
In an old farmhouse in the south of Ireland lives Ben McBrady, a 72-year-old retired civil servant at the Dublin court. His material needs are few, and he manages well on his small pension. Ben reads 4 hours a day, writes poetry, and tends his garden, where he grows most of his own food. His friends call him the Druid. Many of his ancestors were Druids, but at the same time belonged to a secret order, of which Ben may be the last member. He originally set out to become a priest. Then his uncle, who was a disciple of this mysterious order, changed Ben's destiny by selecting him to become a member. The training started at his 12th birthday and took 18 years to complete. He had to develop all sorts of manual skills, in addition to studying history, law, philosophy, and poetry at Trinity College. At 30, his training was completed, and Ben became part of an isolated triad within the order. Unfortunately, the 2 other members of his triad, Milo and Casimir, died unexpectedly. So now, Ben is alone. Since he has had no contact with the order for many years now, he believes that no other members are alive today. Ben's story could be the final chapter in a long and fascinating history. With Ben McBrady, a tradition which has existed for 3,000 years may disappear.
The order of which I may be the last member, by tradition, came into existence after the last great cataclysm or catastrophe which affected the world. Now, with these great and terrible impacts on the earth by great electrical storms being caught up in the tails of meteors or showers of meteorites, civilization as we know it was totally destroyed. All knowledge came within the ambit of the order, but they were particularly concerned with astronomy because they had experienced so many very significant calamities, and it was thought that a full knowledge of astronomy would enable them to predict conditions when these calamities were likely to take place and take some kind of action to protect themselves. If you look at the great megalithic complexes in Ireland, you'll see that what are described as passage graves are really bomb shelters of a very primitive kind. They are well above any tidal wave level, and they also afford protection from meteoric showers. These shelters from aerial bombardment are very common, and they're well known. But what are not so well known, well, they are to archaeologists, but everywhere in the country you get souterrains, which are underground stone chambers. The archaeologists say, without any evidence, that they were stores for grain, mainly. But no grain remains have been found in any of the souterrains of significance which would indicate that that was their primary function. They also served as shelters. They would shelter from outside conditions, and most of them would be well above sea level too, but not as high as the great megalithic ones. It would seem that the very complex ones, the very big ones, such as we get at Carrowkeel and Carrowmore in Sligo, were special ones, like Hitler's bunker, very well preserved, but they would be for special people, presumably for the telepaths. Every great civilization has a record of a period of a golden age when there was no war, no dispute, no lying. And this was attributed to the fact that language had not been discovered, and the telepathic function was the principal means of communication. Now, in relation to the order, those of the few isolated settlements which survived on the European coastline discovered that some retained the telepathic power, but most of them, because of the terrible traumas and trials they had undergone, had lost it. These isolated groups then began to migrate east, and in so doing they had to, in their isolation, develop languages as a means of communication. It does explain why disparate groups scattered all over the earth today have languages with no connection, languages which arose spontaneously. But over and above this, psychics in every community retained a telepathic capacity.
Members of the groups who emigrated east returned to the west. The last people to settle down ended up in Ireland. By then, the remaining telepaths had formed a secret order.
The order at every stage had to remain outside society, within it, but at the same time not of it. A secret order. Secrecy is not something which we think a good thing, but it is essential for survival. And as society developed, it became more and more essential for survival. The old saying is, where do you hide a pebble but on the beach? You can't keep your order secret by going off into a remote place, into a monastery, and cutting yourself off from civilization. It's essential that you interpenetrate the society. Not for any purpose of power, which is the usual aim of most secret societies, but for your own protection. And a secondary function, as far as I can see, from my knowledge of the history of the order, they tried at every stage of history to influence for the good the way history was developing. And their peculiar faculties gave them the capacity to do so. So they may have saved a few bad calamities in that fashion, that social calamities. The dangers were very great. The telepathic capacity is the great danger. It's the great source of danger. Kings, princes, made prisoners of telepaths to use them to interpret the thinking of those around them, to know who are their enemies, where the threats came from.
When members of the order first came to Ireland, they found that a mighty druidic organization existed there.
Members of the order were druids. They infiltrated the druidic organization, which was a highly complex one, and slightly, well, not slightly, but considerably different in Ireland from the continental druids who are described by Caesar in his De Bello Gallicus, the Gaelic wars. Most of his information came from a druid named Divitiacus, who was living in Rome. And according to Divitiacus, the druids were the priests and philosophers and astronomers of the Celtic tribes. They were also magicians and lawgivers, possibly priest kings, but he doesn't make that clear. Now, Caesar was particularly interested in the religions of subject peoples, because the Romans believed that if they captured the idols, they had the gods and the people made no more resistance to them. That was one of their techniques of conquering and ruling. It served both purposes. Now, the Druids, according to Caesar, there have been doubts thrown on whether this Divitiacus existed or not. But according to Caesar, these Druids had a great annual ceremony in which they had sacrifices.
Historians nowadays agree with Ben that no human sacrifices took place in Ireland. However, the Irish Druids did have their ceremonies, among which were the celebrating of Beltane at the beginning of May and Samhain in November.
Now, these ceremonies were carried out usually in oak groves. The oak was a sacred tree to the Celts and to a lot of Aboriginal people, or primitive peoples, who saw spirits in rocks and stones and rivers and growing things of all kinds. The name of the oak, the root term for oak is drua, and from drua, from the practitioners under the oak groves, they got the term druids or druidi, which was the Roman term for druids. Now in Ireland, by coincidence, synchronicity, call it what you like, the Druidic order were worshippers of the god of the sunset, the Da Rua, the red god. And a priest of that order would be called a Chela Da Rua, a servant of the red god. And with a very common thing that happens with language nowadays, we drop the first term. We drop the substantive for the adjective. That process has continued all through time in language. So Chela Da Rua became Da Rua, and Da Rua became Drua or Druid. So that's how the confusion arises between the Druids of Ireland, the Druids of the continent. They have the same name, but for different reasons. Possibly a lot of the fame and esteem that the Druids earned for their knowledge and wisdom derived from the fact that members of the order were among them. And we have that, I think, manifested best in the case of Lugar MacLugair, whose burial place we'll go to visit. MacLugair was the most important Druid of his time, also a member of the order, and appears to have been an ancestor of mine.
For many centuries, priest kings ruled the kingdoms of Ireland. In the 12th century, the leadership function was split in two. The Herenach took care of the worldly matters, while the bishop was responsible for spiritual affairs. Both were hereditary functions until 1699.
The genealogies have been manipulated by early Christian historians to suit their own ends. But I am connected with the diocese of the Two Kilmores. A Herenach of the Two Kilmores could only come from the one bloodline, which is mine. And MacLugair is the ancestor of the earliest recorded Herenach of the Two Kilmores. He is the one who is named as the ancestor of nearly the whole pantheon of early Irish saints.
According to official history, the archdruid Due MacLugair was baptized by St. Patrick in the 5th century. Due was the son of Lugar MacLugair. The same Due MacLugair was the father of St. Bridget.
If we go to the early history of Christianity in this country, the traditional view is that St. Patrick came here as a captive in the 5th century. But by our tradition is that if ever he existed, he came here in the 2nd century. Thomas Carlyle, the great English writer, historian, he was told once that there were 30,000 words written to prove that St. Patrick came to Ireland. And he said that there are just as many lies. There's a great corpus of written material about St. Patrick and early Christianity in Ireland. Maybe not so well known, but it's loaded with anecdotes and tales about the interaction of the Druids with St. Patrick and his followers and the conflicts between them, and how, above all, the only one who was able to smooth over the problems was MacLugair and his descendants. And MacLugair is in the annals, which are definitive, but were altered to suit. MacLugair, with a number of other filla and scribes, was given the job by St. Patrick of transcribing, putting into writing for the first time, the traditions of the Shenkis Mór. The Shenkis Mór was the great corpus of knowledge. It's well known to modern scholars that the genealogies were meddled with. The lists of the kings were meddled with to fit in with a time scale that was wrong, and to phase out the pagan influence, which was still there, to endeavour to phase it out. So our annals start with the year 432. our written annals, which is the year in which St. Patrick is claimed to have arrived. And to me, I can see MacLugair as one of these great characters who emerge in a few generations and totally transform the character of a society. It has happened. But because of the conflicts between paganism, Christianity, he is written out of history, ultimately. I look on him as the inventor of Christianity after St. Paul. St. Paul invented the Roman Christianity. MacLugair and his group were the philosophers who laid out the main tenets of pure Christianity. What we recognize as pure Christianity was the old religion carried from here to the east. But it does seem that the fountainhead of the ancient Christian ethic was here in Killeen. It's a big claim, but over the centuries we have had the phenomenon of thousands upon thousands of Irish missionaries going all over the world, more than any other country, spreading Christianity.
Killeen Cormac is the burial place of Lugar MacLugair and his son Documentario MacLugair. The mortal remains of other druids, kings and saints are also buried here. Yet Killeen Cormac is not an Irish national monument, nor is it listed in any tourist guide. It is not even signposted. It is a secret and magical place.
MacLugair and his antecedents and his successors lived in an area called Kennel Lugar in County Kildare, which in ancient times was a great marsh. There were two islands in the marsh. One was the settlement of the group, and the other was the temple and the burial place. The ancient stones there make a link with Christianity in that we have the only Ogham stone in Ireland which has both a Latin and an Old Irish inscription written in Ogham, cut in Ogham on the stone.
Ogham is not a language but an alphabet. The inscription on the stone reads, "For true druids."
It was one of the places where Jesus, as a wandering scholar, was inducted into the ancient wisdoms of the order and then returned to Palestine to begin his mission over there. And up to the last century, a place was pointed out as the Jew's house. It didn't mean that that was simply where Jesus stayed, but that was where Jewish scholars were located. Scholars came from all over the world to ancient Ireland, and that drift continued well into medieval times. there were over 5,000 foreign students in the great school. Clonmacnoise had that number, but the more important school was in the Midlands, Clonard, St. Finian's School at Clonard. That was the school where St. Columkill was educated. But you must remember that well up into medieval times, those schools, though purporting, and monastic schools and settlements, though purporting to be Christian, were carrying on a pre-Christian philosophy, religion, observance, and were always in conflict with the Roman version of Christianity.
These fundamental differences led in 1155 to Henry II getting the papal consent to invade Ireland in order to restore and safeguard proper Roman Christianity. Together with economic reasons, this resulted in nearly 800 years of British rule in Ireland.
The real explanation, I suppose, is that paganism, or pre-Christian Christianity, was so well rooted here that they wouldn't allow any new form of it to come in. That's Roman Christianity. That we still carried on the ancient philosophies and beliefs, and some of the solar worship which was absorbed into Christianity. If we see we can't see the very early churches, but the earliest we have clearly are just small temples for solar worship. And you see it in Glendalough too, the earliest churches. They simply allow a ray of light to come in to illuminate the altar and the sacred vessels and transform. That's the transubstantiation, the changing of the energy of light into the liquid which goes into your body. That seems to be central to all religious practices. It's the core of religious belief. The monstrance, in fact, is a vestigial relic of sun worship used in Christian churches. It is a manifest sun. It has a central part, the rays radiating from it, and they put the sacred wafer in the middle after consecration. Each king had his druid, but Christianity, they were incompatible with Christianity, and they disappeared as a group. The order, however, continued to survive by adapting itself to Christianity and becoming part of the Christian organization, but keeping its traditions, keeping its beliefs, and acting inside Christianity, the Christian matrix. And that wasn't simply in Ireland, but all over Europe. And we find then MacLugair not only adopting Christianity, but becoming the ancestor, as the genealogy shows, the ancestor of most of the early Christian saints in Ireland, and the ancestor of the royal houses, including my own, the bishops of the Due Kilmores. Consequently, a good proportion of the order existed within monastic communities, religions of all kinds. In this country, it may have narrowed down the number in that, so far as I'm aware, the surviving members of the order had to have several primary requirements for admission. A, they had to have telepathic power. B, they had to be poets. C, they had to be of the priestly bloodline. And in ancient Ireland, the priestly bloodline was the ruling line, because it was priest kings who ruled. It's very likely that some of the very prominent and very strange religious characters in medieval times were members of the order. They did manifest the qualities of those of the order. From my study of history, that appears to me to be the case. From the 6th to on up into the 9th century, there were missionaries, Irish missionaries were keeping in contact with the continent and founding monasteries all over Europe. But these monasteries, because I think of the influence of the order, were monasteries of Pelagianism, not of the Christianity as we know it. Pelagius was eventually condemned as the arch-heretic. He was the first and the greatest heretic according to Christian history. But in fact, Pelagianism was the ancient religion which Christ brought back, which was, I think, altered by the Romans, by St. Paul particularly, to suit the Roman imperium, so that the Catholic religion, Catholic apostolic religion, became the new Roman Empire in the 5th century after the breakup, the so-called breakup of the Roman Empire. It was originally the task of each member of the order to be a compendium of all knowledge, all known knowledge. That was the reason for the long term of training. If humanity was totally wiped out, except for one individual, he should be capable of re-establishing everything from his own resources. Now, because in the last 2 centuries, because of the exponential increase in knowledge and techniques and skills, medicine, everything, it wouldn't be within the compass of a single human mind, or you wouldn't have the time to train someone to encompass everything. The system of triads was developed, whereby 3 were brought together.
Ben, Milo and Casimir formed such a triad. Because of their telepathic powers, each was able to draw on the other's knowledge. But because of the increase over the last 50 years in radio and telecommunication, telepathy has become impossible. According to Ben, all human communication, language itself, is suffering severe damage.
And that is why it was a primary function of the order to preserve language. Language is a kind of magic by which we trigger off telepathic transmission of messages between us. And if you look about the world today, we are becoming more and more confused, more and more cut off from one another. We're all living in our own little realms of unknowing. This is the great dilemma of our times. We will never have an end to cruelty and war and oppression and greed and all these evils that we see bubbling all the time. This is a thing which I believe very strong. I know it. I don't just believe it. I know it. I see it about me and I sense it. There has to be a great revolution of the spirit. Otherwise, the world is finished. It doesn't need the atomic bomb. It doesn't need any of the worst horrors of modern technology, the smart bomb, mustard gas, nerve gas. We will destroy ourselves in some other fashion. But it's essential the amnesia is got rid of, that we get back to a state of primitive thinking, clear. Technology must be brought under proper control. We, in the order, we never condemn technology because it has given great benefits to humanity. It has taken away a lot of suffering and pain in medicine, and it has enabled knowledge to be diffused much better. But at the same time, it has outstripped the development of the spirit. And then the evil side of technology. We've seen its results everywhere. So this revolution of the spirit will have to be achieved. And this time it'll have to be achieved without the help of the order. So the order has ceased, in my opinion, to have any further function in society. When people say to me, "Oh, do you not feel in despair because you think you're the last of the order?" And I quote Tennyson to them. Tennyson says, "The old order changeth, yielding place to new, and God fulfills himself in many ways, lest one good custom should corrupt the world." We must change. A new order will evolve, a new order will emerge. It's either that or total destruction. And when I say total destruction, it doesn't mean absolute annihilation, but the ending of things as we understand them. The fundamental training of the order was to achieve balance, not to discard new knowledge, not to discard old knowledge. Keep a balance between them. Keep a proper balance in everything. That faculty has been disturbed. Order depends on a balance of forces. You can't have a cosmos, as Einstein says, designed by an idiot. There has to be order. In fact, the meaning of cosmos is order, as against chaos, which is disorder. The balance between these two forces must be achieved. As a natural law, as a fundamental law that we know inherently, we know intuitively that that is so. I've been told this very often, and I said it myself, that if you had scoured the world for the most unsuitable candidate to be a member of the order, I was that person. So far as my mental attitudes and general disposition are concerned, that I always had within me A, an inborn skepticism, and B, a sense of the ludicrous, which made me look on all rituals and practices as being games playing, and a carryover of other childish attitudes into adult life. I enjoyed it and still do. He kissed me under the Moorish wall, and I thought, well, as well him as another. And then I asked him with my eyes to ask again, yes. And then he asked me, would I? Yes, to say yes, my mountain flower. And first I put my arms around him, yes, and drew him down to me, so he could feel my breasts all perfume. Yes, and my heart was going like mad, and yes, I said, yes, I will, yes. The way I look at life is what distinguishes, say, great writers like Joyce from others is that they are yea-sayers to life. The last sentence in Ulysses is yes, yes, yes. Molly Bloom is saying yes to life. So I was taught that lesson, that we must say yes to life. We must take the positive. The other side lies death and destruction, which is created by us. We can create death. We can't create life. And man is engaged to the limit of his faculties and abilities in creating death. That's why a great transformation has to come. Otherwise, everything goes. That's the moral I derived from that whole issue. So now I continue travelling hopefully, which is better than to arrive.